I'm going to speak on the history of environmental thought and activism in India. I've called my talk The Three Waves of Indian Environmentalism. And I'm going to enumerate each of these three waves, when they came, who were the main actors, what were the main ideas. By my definition, if environmentalism is a product of the industrial age, I believe that the first wave of Indian environmentalism ran from 1915, when Gandhi comes back from South Africa, till 1950, when the Constitution is enacted. Now, this period is extremely interesting for the historian of ideas. From about 1919, 1920, there was a sense among thinking Indians across the country that one day we would be free. There was a popular national movement across the country in which men, women, Hindus, Muslims, peasants, workers, all participated. And there was a sense that this national movement would be the crucible of a country that would come into being called independent India. And this anticipation of an independent country led to a wave of debates about what the country's future would be like. What would its economic system would be like? What would its social system would be like? Would Dalits have equal rights as Brahmins? Would women have equal rights as men? What kind of health system would be put in place? How would we integrate Ayurveda, for example, with modern medicine? Education. Did we have to follow the Western model? Or could we find ways of integrating, our traditions with Western science? So it was a period extremely fertile in intellectual debates on all aspects of political and social life. Anticipations of the nation that was going to come into being under the leadership of Gandhi and the freedom struggle led to an efflorescence of debates. For example, there's some books on this. One very good book is an old book by Shiv Vishwanathan, whose column some of you might read, called Organizing for Science, which is it's a book about debates on science policy in the 30s and 40s, before India became independent. And in this context, there was also an environmental debate, which, in my view, constitutes the first wave of Indian environmentalism. And as with many other debates in this period, 1920 to 1950, Gandhi was at the center of it. Now, I'm going to read you a statement from Gandhi, which is entirely relevant to our symposium, and which is also completely authentic. Unlike the statement referred to earlier, Gandhi never said the world has enough for our need, but not enough for our greed. It's made up. It was made up by Wikipedia. It doesn't exist in the collected works. You can have a debate as to whether it expresses his sentiments, probably yes, but he actually never said it. But I'm going to read out a statement he actually said. And this is from 1928, December, and it comes, interestingly, from a debate he's having with communists. Ram mentioned in his talk the debate between communism and capitalism. Now, it was famously said, I forget whom, by a Western wit, that what is the difference between communism and capitalism? This is when the Soviet Union was powerful in the 1950s, the height of the Cold War. One wit asked, what is the difference between communism and capitalism? And he answered, capitalism rests on the exploitation of man by man. In communism, it is the other way around. And apart from exploitation of man by man, communism and capitalism are also conjoined, as Ram hinted, by the sense that there are no limits to growth, that compound growth will continue indefinitely. In the words of the economist Wilfred Beckerman, writing in 1974, economic growth can continue for the next 2,500 years. Now, this is something that Gandhi had reservations about. And in 1928, he said, and I'm going to read out to you, God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization after the manner of the West. The economic imperialism of a single tiny island kingdom, namely England, is today, namely 1928, keeping the world in chains. And then he continues, if an entire nation of 300 million, which is what we were then, 1928, if an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts. Now, you add China to it, 2.5 billion people. If we took to similar economic exploitation, we will indeed strip the world bare like locusts. Now, in my view, the key phrase in this Gandhi quote is, after the manner of the West. God forbid that India took to industrialization after the manner of the West, not took to industrialization full stop. Because Gandhi recognized, as did all the other great freedom fighters, whether it be Nehru or Bose or Patel or Ambedkar, that we were a desperately poor country. We needed economic growth. We needed to lift the masses of our people out of poverty. We needed to give them decent education, healthcare, dignified living, conditions for productive and gainful employment. But if we industrialized after the manner of the West, namely using the energy-intensive, resource-intensive technologies, we would strip the world bare like locusts. Gandhi was what I call an instinctive and intuitive environmental thinker. He was not a systematic environmental thinker. He had certain ideas, which I've expressed in this quote, but he was doing many other things. He never had the time to seriously explore what could be an economic development policy for India that did not ape the West, while at the same time lifting the masses of Indians from desperate poverty. But others did. There was a man called Albert Howard. Again, one of the reasons I have problems with demonization of foreigners. Some of the most interesting people who worked in India in this period were foreigners, who identified with Indians. Albert Howard was an agricultural scientist who pioneered organic agriculture. He's a worldwide pioneer of organic agriculture, and this was based on his studies of Indian peasants. And he developed what he called the Indore method of composting, working in Indore. There were some extraordinary naturalists, Salim Ali and M. Krishnan, who were writing in the 30s and 40s about the importance of biodiversity and the necessity of preserving them. There was a visionary urban planner called Patrick Geddes, who was a Scotsman who came to India in 1915, and between 1915 and 1930 wrote a series of plans on different Indian cities advocating an environmental or ecological theory of urban town planning. Unfortunately, no one listened to him. Otherwise, we would have had cities which were, and we can still read his work and get clues on how to make Bangalore more habitable, how to more actively encourage resource recycling, sustainable energy, sustainable forms of transport. So there were a whole range of thinkers trying to outline ways in which India would promote economic development to eliminate mass poverty, but without making the mistakes of the West. And among these thinkers, I hope one day, by the way, if I live long enough, to write a book on this first wave of environmentalism. I've done a great deal of research on it, but I've been distracted by the 2-volume biography I'm writing on Gandhi, which may take me another 6 or 7 years. But if I live long enough, I hope to write a book on this constellation of thinkers between 1915 and 1950, who were saying, doing, writing, and acting out their ideas in most interesting and remarkable ways. But I've got to end this discussion of the first wave, then I'll come to the second wave, with 2 quotes from 2 Gandhians. I said that Gandhi was, an instinctive environmental thinker. But 2 of his close associates developed his ideas much more systematically. One was a Tamil Christian called J.C. Kumarappa, who left his flourishing accountancy practice in Bombay. He'd been trained in London as an accountant, worked in a chartered accountant's firm in Bombay, was inspired by Gandhi, left the practice, joined Gandhi, and Gandhi said, since you're trained as an economist, you go and work among the villages of Gujarat and find out how to run them on sustainable lines. So Kumarappa was a pioneer of water conservation, the desilting of tanks, of community forest management, of recycling, of enhancing and improving artisanal technologies. You know, he wrote a book called The Economy of Permanence. It's a wonderful phrase. This is 1938, you know, 80 years before our sustainability stuff. The economy of permanence. How to cultivate an economy of permanence. And Kumarappa greatly influenced E.F. Schumacher and his book, Small is Beautiful, which was written in the early 70s, which has a chapter called The Economics of Permanence, you know, without acknowledgement to Kumarappa. The title is lifted from Kumarappa's book. So Kumarappa was the first Indian environmentalist who, inspired by Gandhi, tried to forge a program of ecologically sustainable agriculture and artisanal production. And in the course of one of his essays, he said something quite remarkable, but which I will read out to you, which you could see this paragraph that I will read out to you, which is from his book, The Economy of Permanence, is a kind of template for ecological responsibility. It goes like this. If we produce everything we want from a limited area, we are in a position to supervise the methods of production. So, for example, one of the tenets of Gandhian ecology, practiced, say, in the realm of architecture by Laurie Baker, the great Kerala architect of English origin, was to use local materials. So build your homes using mud and stone and wood and thatch gathered locally. So if we produce everything we want from a limited area, we are in a position to supervise the methods of production, while if we draw our requirements from the end of the earth, it becomes impossible for us to guarantee the conditions of production in such places. Now, what is the modern lifestyle? It is things come from everywhere. You know, if you are a global citizen, I have never called myself a global citizen. Sometimes people, because they know I detest chauvinism, xenophobia, jingoism, the worship of Bharat Mata, people know that I detest all these things. So sometimes by way of a compliment, they tell me you're a global citizen. I say I'm not a global citizen, because there is no world state. There is the Indian state, and one of the responsibilities of a citizen is to criticize his state. And since I can't criticize the world state because it doesn't exist, I'm not a global citizen. But those who consider themselves global citizens, what this means is that when they are living in London, they can get oyster from Newfoundland, they can get tamarind from India, they can get teak wood from Burma. So their lifestyle is global, which means the resources they use come from all over the world. That is Kumarappa. The second Gandhian I want to introduce you to briefly is better known than Kumarappa, because she figures in Attenborough's film. She was the daughter of an English admiral called Madeline Slade, who joined Gandhi in 1926 and became his adopted daughter, acquired the name Miraben, by which she is known as to students of modern Indian history. And she worked with Gandhi from the 1920s to the 1940s. Now, what is not so well known is that in the mid-40s, she left Gandhi's ashram for a variety of complex reasons I won't go into here, and moved to the Himalaya and set up an ashram in the Himalaya called Pashulok. And this was on the banks of the Ganga in what is now Tehri Garhwal. And she worked there for 13 or 14 years. And in those years, she did very important environmental work. One of the things she did, she was one of the first people to recognize the devastation that large dams caused to village communities and to ecology. And she wrote to Nehru, whom she knew through the freedom struggle. You know, she knew Nehru, she knew Rajendra Prasad, and she wrote to them about the damage caused by large dams. She got no answer. She wrote about the damage caused by chemical agriculture, and she also wrote about the damage caused by the expansion of pine trees at the expense of oak forests in the Himalaya. If you look at the Himalaya, that is Garhwal, Kumaon, Himachal Pradesh, forests are broadly composed of broadleaf species such as oaks and beeches, and conifers like a pine and spruce and fir. And the broadleaf species are much more important to the local economy because you can get fodder, fuel, medicinal plants, and much better, so better for the economy, also much better ecologically, because broadleaf species have a lot of leaf litter, and the leaf litter gathers on the floor. So when the monsoon comes, the water flow is regulated. In fact, wherever there are oak forests in the Himalaya, you have springs below. So villages are often sited below the oak forest. Now what happens when pine forests come in is that the pine forests have no leaf litter. So the ground is barren underneath, and when the monsoon comes, there is massive soil erosion leading to floods. But pine forests are extremely important commercially, because the plywood factories want them, the paper mills want them. So there was a massive expansion by the government of pine forests at the expense of oak forests in the 1950s, which Miraben opposed. And if she had been listened to, the terrible forest fires that just took place in Uttarakhand, which were because of the expansion of the pine, would not have taken place. Now, she was again what I call an early environmentalist of this period, 1920 to 1950. I'm going to read out a quote from her. 1949, it's an article she wrote in the Hindustan Times in 1949, and it's extremely prophetic. I mean, it speaks to us today. This is someone writing 70 years ago, and we are rediscovering in our own way the wisdom of what she wrote 70 years ago. She said, "The tragedy today is that educated and moneyed classes are altogether out of touch with the fundamentals of existence. They are out of touch with Mother Earth and the animal and vegetable population which she sustains. This world of nature's planning is ruthlessly plundered, despoiled, and disorganized by man whenever he gets the chance. By his science and machinery, he may get huge returns for a time, but ultimately will come desolation. We have got to study nature's balance and develop our lives within her laws if we are to survive as a physically healthy and morally decent species." This is someone observing the impact of growing industrialization, commercialization of agriculture, deforestation in the Himalaya. These thinkers, I've just given you a glimpse of some of these thinkers who were active in this period between 1915 and 1950. They constitute what I call the first wave of Indian environmentalism. However, when we became independent in 1947, when we enacted our constitution in 1950, and most of all, when the Planning Commission was formed and the second five-year plan was formalized in 1956, these thinkers were marginalized. They were seen as holding up development, as backward. And the task before us, as understood by the economists and the technocrats of the time, was follow the Western model, because that's the only way to lift our masses out of poverty. That's the only way to build an industrial and technological base, to consolidate our standing in the world. Now, some of this is necessary. I think it's very important, and I think both Ram and Madhuji will agree with me, that no one is, asking for a return to the past. No one is asking for every Indian to live like Gandhiji, or even Madhuji. That kind of austerity and asceticism comes naturally only to a few people. But the neglect of the understanding, the scientific understanding of the dangers of unregulated commercial forestry, the dangers of chemical farming, the importance of reviving and renewing community systems of water and forest management that had fallen into decay under British rule. These are things that could have been integrated in our planning system, but were ignored. Because anyone who spoke of environmentalism in the 1950s and 1960s was seen as a romantic, a reactionary, holding up progress, and so on and so forth. So the first wave of environmentalism is that of these thinkers in the 20s and 30s who are presently warning us about blindly imitating the capital-intensive, resource-intensive model of industrialization followed by the West. The second wave starts in 1973 with the Chipko movement, which was the subject of my first book, The Unquiet Woods, originally published in 1989, but more recently in a revised edition. And the Chipko movement, as all of you know, was a movement of peasants in the Himalaya in the same region in which Miraben worked, 20 years later, protecting against unregulated commercial logging that was damaging them economically, socially, and environmentally. In 1970, there was a massive flood in the Himalaya, in the Alaknanda Valley. And that brought home to the Chipko activists, who were actually all Gandhians, the importance of forest conservation. Now, Chipko was significant for 7 reasons. First, it was indigenous. It was not a Western model. No one could say that it was World Wildlife Fund or someone who imposed it on us. These were peasants in the Himalaya who, based on their folk understanding of the role forests had played in their social and economic and cultural life, protested. Secondly, its cultural associations were recognizable. It was the watershed of the Ganga, which is home to the great rivers, and also the technique of protest was totally non-violent. So it recalled Gandhi. Chipko means to hug a tree. Thirdly, Chipko articulated what I call a social ecology. It was not about protecting nature per se, but about integrating environmental sustainability in the lives of peasants and artisans. So it was about sustainable village economics, in which nature has a role. You recognize its beauty, its aesthetic qualities, but you also see that there's this balance, which the previous speakers, both Madhurji and Ramal, talked about, between individual, society, and nature. And if that balance is restored, by destroying nature, individual and society also unravel. The fourth reason Chipko was important is that Chipko was not only about protest, it was about reconstruction. The great Chipko leader Chandi Prasad Bhatt, who is still alive, who is in his 80s, who started the Chipko Andolan, who's not that well known outside Garhwal because he doesn't speak English. He only speaks Hindi. But after he organized the first movement to protest against commercial felling, he said, now I must organize village communities for afforestation. So all the barren hillsides of the upper Alaknanda Valley were taken up by his NGO, the Dasoli Gram Swarajya Mandal, and with village women in the lead through their Mahila Mandals, these barren slopes were replanted with indigenous species, with oak and beech and chestnut species. And 10 years after this program commenced, a scientist from the Center for Ecological Sciences in the IIC went to study these plantations, and he did a comparison of community plantations organized by Gandhian women and forest department plantations, and he found that the survival rate of saplings in the forest department plantation was 15%, that in the community plantations was 85%. So I think mobilizing communities, not only to protest environmental disruption and social dispossession, organize them non-violently, that's one part of environmentalism. The other part is reconstruction. Organizing communities to revive, for example, in southern Karnataka, fantastic work can be done on reviving our tank irrigation systems. Instead of leaving it to the Department of Minor Irrigation of the government, which is apathetic and indolent and corrupt, it will be much more productive to actually mobilize village communities to revive these tanks. Fifthly, Chipko was followed by many other movements, similar movements. You think of the Narmada Andolan of the 1980s, which raised similar questions. The Kerala fisher folk struggle of artisanal fisher folk who had been dispossessed by large trawlers. Sixthly, these social movements, such as Chipko and Narmada, had a major impact on public policy. It was because of movements such as Chipko that for the first time, at both the central and the state level, a Department of Environment was created, later upgraded to a full-fledged Ministry of Environment and Forests. It was because of these social movements that you had changes in the forest law to ban the planting of exotics, which had a major negative impact on. In fact, one of my complaints against IIM Bangalore is that there are hardly any indigenous trees. There are too many exotics. This is just terrible. You go to the Infosys campus in Mysore, which is huge, and you will never hear a bird sing because they are all foreign species. I welcome foreign men and women. I have no hang-up about that. But forest species is a problem, because that is nature's way of, wherever you have indigenous species, you will have fruits which local people can eat, you will have insects, you will have birds, you will have wildlife. One of the great tragedies of the forest department is that their promotion of eucalyptus. Traditionally, our avenue trees were all, honge and mango and jackfruit. Once you had targets, once Sanjay Gandhi told the forest department, plant 1,000 trees. The easiest way to plant 1,000 trees is to throw a few eucalyptus saplings, because they need no care, the goats don't browse them, and they'll come up. And once they come up, the monkeys, who are traditionally in the jackfruit and the honge trees, have nowhere to go, and they'll attack the farmers' crops. So I think the changes in forest policy brought about by CIPCO. The first time a pollution control board was created in India was 1974, although we've been polluting our rivers at least since the 19th century. So these social movements had a major impact on public policy. And finally, these social movements also had an impact on science and social science. You would not, scientists like A.K.N. Reddy, a pioneer of sustainable energy, Madhav Gadgil, the ecologist, M.S. Swaminathan, who is in many ways a very admirable person, not least because he's willing to recognize the mistakes he committed, which is extremely rare. I mean, there's virtually no Indian man who has ever made a mistake. I don't think Rahul Gandhi and Narendra Modi have ever made mistakes. I don't think Sachin Tendulkar and Amitabh Bachchan have ever made mistakes either. There's no Indian man, maybe no man anywhere, no powerful man anywhere, I should correct that. And M.S. Swaminathan was inspired by CIPCO and other such movements to recognize that the Green Revolution may have been a good short-term solution to food scarcity and famine, but it had serious long-term problems, and he turned to ecological agriculture and the promotion of ecological agriculture and what he calls bio-villages because of the CIPCO movement. So these movements had an impact on public policy, on science, on social activism, on the media. This was the second wave of the Indian environmental movement. The first wave was thinkers. The second wave was social movements and activists. Almost wholly non-violent, I should add. Now, from the beginning, activists in the CIPCO and Narmada movement faced opposition from what I call the anti-environment lobby. Again, they were told, just as J.C. Kumarappa was told in the 1950s when he attended a meeting of the Planning Commission, no, your ideas are all out of date. Now these people were told, you are CIA agents. In the 1970s and 80s, you will remember, was a time of total estrangement between India and America. Because of the Bangladesh war, because of the Bhopal gas tragedy, because of the Vietnam War. And the epithet that would stick was, you are a CIA agent. You want to hold up India's development by opposing this large dam, by opposing this chemical factory. You are holding up India's development, so you are a CIA agent. But this was part of, being an activist or speaking uncomfortable truths is not part of a popularity contest. You can't anticipate this. Now, in the 70s and 80s, you had a period of environmental change and positive response from the state, from the scientific community, and even from the courts. The first PILs on environmental questions were filed in the 1980s. From the 1990s, the backlash started. And this is a consequence of liberalization. Now, liberalization, whose 25th anniversary we mark this month, because it's in June 1991 that I think the first budget was under the Narasimha Rao government was placed on the table. Liberalization was necessary. Now, I think Ram is absolutely right. Socialism has failed. Socialist economics has failed. Industrial socialist economics has failed. State control of state control, excessive regulation of entrepreneurs is self-defeating. And so we had to take away the controls. We had to encourage entrepreneurship. And many good things have happened because of liberalization. It's deepened the business community. It's no longer only the children of Tatas and Birla and Godrej's. Without liberalization, you would not have had middle-class people like Nilekani and Narayan Murthy becoming successful entrepreneurs. Liberalization is also, so it's deepened the social, it's encouraged entrepreneurship, it's deepened the base of entrepreneurship, it has solved our chronic foreign exchange problems, and it has contributed substantially to the reduction of poverty. All this is absolutely important and necessary. However, it has also come with a peculiar blindness to the environment. It's had a negative impact on the environment because while regulation had to be removed from many sectors, I mean, some people in this audience are too young to remember a time when the government owned hotels, bakeries, restaurants, telephone companies, and perhaps some of you who have traveled Air India knows what happens when the government owns a productive enterprise. But we lived through that regime. So a lot of it was necessary. But the one area in which regulations had to remain, indeed had to be strengthened, was the environmental sphere. Because again, to go back to what Ram said, these are externalities. It's absolutely in the rational interest of a firm to pollute a river, because somebody else is paying the cost. Society and nature are paying the cost. Liberalization also led to a terrible collusion between unprincipled entrepreneurs and politicians, leading to the loot of our natural resources. You know, the mining boom. You know, there are two sides to liberalization. One I call creative capitalism, where technology, skill, innovation is used to generate wealth and employment. Infosys and Wipro and Biocon are creative capitalism. The other form of capitalism is the Bellari brothers, which is you must rightly call crony capitalism. And we know of the Bellari brothers because we are from Karnataka. But if you look at Orissa, Chhattisgarh, the mining boom, what is done to the environment to dispossess tribal communities. In Orissa, there were no Naxalites till the mining boom started. And it leads to, you know, it really is like the Wild West. Violence, corruption, intimidation. So there's been a huge environmental cost to liberalization. I mean, and we are now an environmental basket case. You look at our air, 5 of the 10 most polluted cities in the world are from India. You look at our water, all our rivers are contaminated, not least our holiest river, the Ganga. The disposal of chemical waste, destruction of forests, scarcity, drought, siltation of tanks, the halving of shelf lives of reservoirs. We are an environmental basket case. Now, unfortunately, the media, which was a watchdog, and which should be a watchdog, abdicated its role in this period after the 1990s. In the 1970s and 80s, the media played an extremely responsible role. Some of the finest reporting on environmental destruction and its impact on rural communities was done by reporters such as Anil Agarwal, Kalpana Sharma, Daryl DeMonte, even in Indian languages. If any Kannada speaker is here, I urge you to read the works of Nagesh Hegde, who wrote very important works in the 80s and 90s on the destruction of Western Ghats. So that media was very supportive of environmental causes in the 80s. After liberalization, every environmental correspondent was either laid off or redesignated stock market correspondent. And there has been a kind of orchestrated hysteria among some of our leading English language columnists against our environmentalists. You know, I could name names, but I needn't. But some of our most influential columnists and editors have come to the conclusion that the only thing holding India back from being a superpower is Medha Patkar. And if somehow she could be disposed or dispensed with, you know, we would be a superpower, and we'd have 10% rates of growth continuously. It's a terrible misunderstanding, partly ignorance, partly malevolence, of the complex interaction between energy and environment. And the same environmentalists who were called CIA agents in the 80s are now called KGB agents, holdovers of socialism in the 21st century. And I think I myself have been called both, by the way. Now, you know, one of the curious aspects of history, democratic history, is that it goes in cycles. You know, things come into fashion, go out, a movement starts, is energized, is at a high, then it decelerates, then the activists get weary, and then it goes down. So you kind of expect it to come in cycles. Environmentalism was very active in the 70s and 80s. Then you had liberalization, you had attacks on environmentalism, you had activists growing old, and now it's been 25 years since liberalization. A new generation can see what was good and promising about it, and what was complicated and unfortunate and even disastrous about it. And now you have the glimmerings of what I'm calling a third wave of environmentalism, of which this seminar is one sign. In IIM Bangalore was started in the 70s. The IIM Bangalore was started as a kind of, IIM Bangalore itself has undergone a very interesting, curious transformation. It was started as a school promoting public sector economics. In 1975 or 1980, if someone had come here and spoken against the temples of modern India, namely large dams, he or she would have been called a CIA agent. 10 years ago, if someone had spoken against the mining boom, they would have been called a KGB agent. And the fact that this seminar is being held here today with a wide range of speakers and many young people also in the room is a sign that we're emerging on a third wave of environmentalism. And the important thing about the third wave would be to capture on the strength of the first two waves. I think there are three elements to change. You have to change public policy. IIM also has a center of public policy. You have to change public policy. You have to change social action. And of course, you have to change individual behavior. All three are important. And you have to bring in the inputs of the best scientists. I think we have very good scientists in India, but they are never consulted by the government. You have outstanding studies of pollution control, but you think Javadekar ever has time to meet these people? Forget it. He can't get an appointment. One of the problems is that there are many reasons for this. One reason being the domination of the IAS lobby. The Department of Environment was one of the few departments, ministries in the center, whose first two secretaries were scientists. And their best work was done under Qasim and Khusu, who were the first two secretaries, who were high-quality scientists. And then the Babu takes over, and he has no understanding, no respect. And I think scientific knowledge and social activism are both crucial. And I want to end actually with, this is completely sincere. I mean, the work that Akshay Patra is doing is extremely important. Because social activism has two components. One is protest, the other is reconstruction. Protest against unfair laws, against discriminatory practices, non-violent protest. That's what Gandhi taught us. Any person must rise against a law that is unfair, unjust, and discriminatory. That's one part. But sometimes activism, that's the glamour of activism. If you organize a dharna outside the Greenpeace office, outside the SR office, you'll remember about a year ago, 18 months ago, Greenpeace put up, I think a flag, I forget what the flag was, a green flag outside the SR office. If you organize a dharna, you'll get attention. But if you do the kind of work that Akshay Patra is doing, which is, you won't get media attention. Young people are more attracted to activism. But activism, social reconstruction, and science, activism, community work or social reconstruction, and science, high-quality scientific research, are the three pillars on which I believe the third wave of Indian environmentalism must rest. Thank you.